Let me briefly show you what I do to an image like this in Photoshop so that it comes out even better than it already is. Just brings out some highlights, gives me some more flexibility that I wouldn't have in a render application in any of them. I use Photoshop, but of course you can use anything that you like. First of all, let's go and save the image that we've rendered with Blender. I've actually rendered this in 4K and I haven't quite shown you how to change the resolution after the fact, so I'll do this just in a minute. So save as, we're going to go and put this into maybe my demo folder here, and I'll call this one demo stream v2. And I'm not going to save this as Targa, I'm going to go and save this as a PNG, and that's that. I'll go close this down for now. What I did here was on the output tab at the top here, that was set to 1920 by 1080. And that is my aspect ratio that I've used. If I wanted to make that larger, you have two options here. You can either use the percentage option. So if you wanted to make this into an image that's 4 times larger, you'd have to make this 400%. Then that would be the same outcome as changing the image resolution here. Or you're going to leave that as 100%. You can also make it smaller. You can make it like 50%, or you can use the slider to drag something here. Let's leave this at 100. And you can also do maths in these fields. So if I wanted to have this rendered at 4K and I don't really know what 1920 times 2 is, I can just go and click into this field, make sure you go towards the end of the number, and this works in any text field that you have input capabilities on, and you just say times 2 and then hit enter, and then that is basically calculated and turned into the value of what that would be, 3840. So that is the X resolution. Y resolution, we need to do the same thing, times 2, and then we're there. You can also do this with something much larger, so I'll leave that up to you. That's how I render that. It took about 4 minutes to render at the default render settings in Blender. In Photoshop, let me go and open that up. And that's our image. You can always choose Control-1, and then you will see this at 100% resolution. So I see that the focus is nice and sharp. I also see there's a little bit of grain still left there despite the noise reduction. So you can play around with that. There's options that you can reduce grain in Photoshop, but that's not really what we're here for. I'm just going to press Control-0. So that means I'll show the whole image. Control-1 is 100%. Control-0 is show the whole image. I'm going to go and click that little lock icon, make a duplicate of that just in case I do anything untoward, and I'm going to go and make that invisible, just so I'm making changes to the image. I'm going to go and add a couple of correction layers to this, and that's really the easiest thing that you can do with Photoshop. So on this little yin yang icon here, the black and white icon, I click the contrast and brightness option, and this gives me this correction layer. And that means if I go and increase the contrast or increase the brightness, or in fact decrease the brightness, I do this non-destructively. So this means it's sort of a correction layer on top of the image. So if I find it came out a bit too bright, I can go and make that correction here. So maybe I'll go and say -10, and maybe I'll increase the contrast by just maybe 10 as well. It's just something like that. So this is without, this is with. One thing aside from basic color correction is, of course, vignette. So that's an important thing that is sort of makes the outsides of the image a little bit subtly darker than the rest of the image. And that really draws the attention to a particular aspect of the image. So we obviously want her to be the center focus. So I can either draw a circle around her and then dim everything else down a little bit if I wanted to really emphasize that. Or I just do it like a normal camera would do it and add a little bit of a vignette on the outside. So to do that, I'm going to go and create myself a brand new layer with a plus icon down here, and then I'll go and choose either the elliptical marquee tool or the rectangular one. Doesn't really matter. I'm going to use the rectangular one and draw out something like this. So these are the parts of the image that are going to be darkened. I need to have this the other way around, so I'm going to go and inverse my selection. I press G on the keyboard to get the paint bucket tool, and considering I have black, I'm going to go and click into this inverted frame on the outside here. That makes everything black. Control D will remove my selection, and so that I can also use this non-destructively, I'm going to go and right click on my layer here and turn that into a smart object. It's a little convoluted way of doing it, but I'm going to go and apply a blur filter to this. And if I do this as a smart object, the good news is that if I change my mind about how much the blur needs to be, that I can change my mind later. So I'll head over here to filter, and then I'll say under blur, I'll say Gaussian blur. And that is difficult to say. Is that enough? Is that too much? I might go and have it it at 150, but then I might, you know, change my mind and have it at 100. So I don't really know yet. Let me go and use 150 here. And this is now my vignette around here. That is, of course, way too much. I don't really want it to be that strong. And the easiest way to do that is then to turn down the opacity of that layer over here. So I go and can blend that in, which will also have an impact on my color corrections. You'll find that this is now making my image too dark or not dark enough. So that is something that you can now change there. If I find this isn't encroaching enough into my image, I can now double click my Gaussian blur layer and change my mind about this. Maybe I want to have this in 200, and that gives this a much softer blur, but it might be better for my image. I can't quite tell yet. It might be nice. So once again, without, with. And it's a subtle change, but once again, it now is, there's no doubt about it. Where are the important parts of the image? It's here, it's in the center, it's not on the outside. And it's such a small thing that you can use to just draw a bit of more attention to the image. I probably also have that as the last layer. So I'm going to take that control layer down. And then I can go and recorrect that. If I wanted to have that brighter or, you know, less bright, I can make that happen. Other control layers that exist that I frequently use are the ones for basic color correction. So that is the color balance that I use for that. That just adds itself on top there. So in our case, it's a bit of a night scene. So I'm thinking we're going to go and make this a bit bluer, like so. That uses the midtones right now, but you have a choice here between shadows, highlights, and the midtones. Midtones and shadows is probably what I would do here. I'd probably leave the highlights as they are. And notice that if I go and choose my shadows, then while they do take on that color of their own, you also notice that some of the midtones are changing as well. So they're sort of, you know, they're going one into the other. Preserve luminosity sometimes clips colors where you don't want them, so you can disable that, and then you only change the color without that having an impact on your luminosity. So I'm thinking something like this, and then going back into the midtones here might actually be quite nice. But one other thing that I would recommend, especially in a spooky horror scene here, is I would go and use vibrance correction layer here. If I do that, then I have other controls here for desaturating the image a little bit. So on 0, this is going to be black and white. That's obviously a little bit too much, but on something like -10, -20, that gives us a little bit of a nice spooky look. So you maybe don't want that to be like a very over colored, saturated summer image like this. I don't think the skin tone here works well. I mean, this is now way too saturated. So what I would do here is I would just desaturate the image a little bit to something like that, like -10, -15, something like that. And vibrance is something that is a bit like saturation. It uses different colors to accentuate and desaturate. So usually it leaves out the skin tones from saturation. So if you have that in bright outdoor images, you can crank up the vibrance without the skin tones turning red, but the blues and the greens would now sort of pop. And if you do that, obviously if you overdo that, bring my saturation back to 0. If you overdo that, notice that the skin tone doesn't change, but the green of the tree and the blue in the sky, that certainly does change. You can also do that partially with masks, of course, but I'm not going to go into that in this tutorial. So I'm just going to go and crank the vibrance up a little bit, crank down the saturation, and that's pretty much all I would do to this image. I'd probably now go and regulate the contrast a little, maybe make that a little darker, spookier, something like that. And I think that is it. I hope you got a lot out of it. I'm sort of proud of what we did here together, and I'm really glad I could show it to you. And I hope you could apply some of these tips and tricks to your own renders. And just remember, little accentuating lights really make all the difference. You can really highlight your assets that way, and you can bring out detail that wasn't there before. The answer is not just crank up the HDRI or use as many ghost lights as you can possibly muster. That is not a good idea. Accentuate what you want to bring out, and likewise don't accentuate what you don't want to bring out. So like the harsh leaves of the fake tree here, that looks now much better that it has depth of field. And vignette is a good idea, final color correction is a good idea, and bring out your characters and make them look their best. I mean, once again, the most important tip I can give you is that these sort of whitish outlines around the character really are such an important thing to bring out something that you want to show. Likewise, catch lights here on the RDP in the background, things like emphasizing the fence panel panels here or something like this archway that would have been, or in fact the tree, they would have all totally drowned had you not done anything about it. And I know it was a lot of work, and I know it seems like a lot of steps, like 779,000 steps, and it really isn't easy if you don't know an application, but I tell you, these principles are important for any 3D application you use. It doesn't matter if it's Blender or Unreal Engine or DAZ Studio or anything else that you want to make pictures with. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your generous support over the years. I really appreciate that. I hope you got a lot out of this series, and I hope I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.